Welcome back to Shat on TV, True Detective, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series, True Detective. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons. Alongside me is my co-host, the King Bee.
I've pledged one positive tweet per day.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of True Detective and provide our thoughts and analysis. This week's episode was entitled The Final Country. King Bee, what'd you think?
Well, crime fans, we're in the final stretch. I think for the second time in a row, we're given a relatively tame episode with some thoughtful, kind of low-key reveals. I think everything's really mapped out for us finally. And then it just comes down to that final scene in the episode really making us hungry for this week to pass.
Yeah, about a quarter of the way through this episode, I thought, man, this is going to be another slow one. I was really bummed out by that. There didn't seem to be anything really happening. And then suddenly we got a lot of payoff in the last, I'd say, quarter of this episode. Sometimes these episodes are necessary to really set the tone for the finale and also just get you your facts that you absolutely need. I think they did it with a little bit of flair. They showed us some different things that we haven't seen before in True Detective Season 3.
Yeah, I'm with you. They definitely knew when to pace themselves and when to sprint as far as throwing information at us. Ultimately, I think it was all delivered in a pretty organized and clean fashion.
And I got to see my Mahershala Ali nude scene. I finally got it. Thank you, HBO.
When was the last time you wore a pair of boxers like that?
I think when I was 9 years old, I had camouflage G.I. Joe boxers, and I wore those. But I didn't realize that like you were supposed to wear pants with those. I just wore those, and I had a little G.I. Joe pop-up tent and a little walkie-talkie set, and I just chilled in those. It was, it was Arizona. It was summertime.
I'm not interested in your pop-up tent, bro.
But one of the things that we saw, speaking of Wayne, is I was noticing the way that he was shot in this episode versus other episodes, and I think there was a lot of reason for that. So if you notice in previous episodes 1 through 6, we saw Roland and Wayne, and they get along pretty well for partners on this show. Typically, partners don't get along as well. You had Cole and Hart kind of coming at the world from two different angles. These guys seem to get along really well. They seem to care about each other, but you see them on equal footing. Yes, one is black and one is white, and it is Arkansas and in the 80s and 90s. But when they're sitting in the squad car side by side, there's a tit for tat. They seem like equals and partners. You rarely see them standing in the same frame. And in this episode, there's lots of scenes where you saw Roland and Wayne, they're standing next to each other, and you realize a couple of things. One is that body language. You see Roland, just like the way he uses language, he's very relaxed, he's very loose. He leans up on the car, he leans up on furniture. He's pretty laid back and a get-along kind of guy. And now you're seeing Wayne, especially this is 90s Wayne. He's got that flat top going, very physically imposing, wide-eyed, very aggressive. And you're starting to see that this episode is really trying to highlight the difference between the two guys.
Yeah, it took me a while. I didn't really pick up on the physical notions of it until after you'd mentioned it. I took it more as both of these guys adopt a posture that kind of dictates where they are in their lives. Roland is kind of resigned at this point to just clock in and out. He wants to help his buddy if he can. He's not real fired up about this case. If it solves, it solves. And if it doesn't, he knows he did what he was there to do. And Wayne on the other side of this fence he's a hunter. He's stalking his prey. He's hungry, and he's ready to jump at the first chance for whatever he needs to strike at.
When we see Wayne trying to get Roland fired up about going after Harris James in episode 7, he does bring up the personal connection between Roland and Tom Purcell. Now that you mention that, King B, that clicks for me because he's trying to find some reason to get Roland as invested as he is, to get him as fired up as he is. And so he takes it beyond the job. Roland's passion for this case isn't necessarily, at least in 19, isn't necessarily finding Julie or slamming the jail cell door on the right guy. It's about getting even for Tom, or setting things right at least.
Well, beyond that, he wanted to help his old buddy, give him another shot at a career. He says as much, hey, we're not here to make waves. This is just to get you paid, like get you back on your feet, because clearly you're not doing so hot.
And as a nice bookend on that, in 2015, Roland and Wayne are talking to each other, old man Roland, old man Wayne. And Wayne apologizes to him, and he says, I didn't realize how different we were, for basically bringing him in on the Harris James attack.
in that scene, which I really, really loved, it's clear that recently he has remembered what he had done to damage their relationship. He's carrying the weight of that. Do you think that he knows, believing that Roland is, closeted, is Wayne keyed into this finally? Is he aware of it? What is his feeling about that?
I mean, it's possible. I didn't think about it until you brought it up. I think that he's looking at it much more from the case of Roland is a people person. He cares about people, and I think that he knows that Roland and Tom have a special connection. I don't know if he's pinned it as a sort of sexual thing. Even if it's not a sexual relationship between Tom and Roland, just them identifying each other as homosexuals, I don't think, A, that we're sure that Roland is gay, and B, that Wayne would be keyed in on any sort of relationship between the two.
I guess even as we're discussing it now, I'm asking myself, does it even matter? As fans, I think there's a lot of bandying about or whether he is or whether he isn't, or if he's closeted and it's a secret. Is the sexuality even that important to the dynamic of these characters? Ultimately, no. Like, straight dudes should have these feelings too.
Yeah, with one episode left to go, I ask myself, is it even important that Tom was gay? Like, does it impact the crime or the story at all? I mean, there's still a possibility there's a twist at the end, but you could see critics of the show, and you see this all the time with people kind of looking at the quote-unquote social justice warrior aspects of like Star Wars and stuff like that, where they're like, did they have to make this superhero a woman? Or did they have to make this superhero black? Or did they have to make Tom gay? Is it a stretch? Is it just an inclusivist action, or is it actually a part of the story?
Maybe it says something about us as people, the fact that we're so obsessed with identity and nomenclature these days. The Pray the Gay Away pamphlet we see in Tom's drawer, maybe that's just to say that this guy's got more than one problem in his fucking life, and he's ultimately a very troubled and conflicted person. We can have just that tiny hint that there are these issues without it having to be a major part of his character bio.
Right. It's important to note that Tom does have feelings for Lucy, which are also demonstrated in this episode too. In earlier episodes when he tries to reach out and hold her hand and she won't touch him. In this episode, you see when he's kind of packing things up to get out of town in the 80s, he's loading up the car and he says, it's not just the children. It's, I don't have Lucy. I don't have the kids. Like, I'm done here. I have nothing, left to live. I just want to be nowhere and feel nothing.
I'm into it. I'm glad we've learned a little bit about ourselves.
Another thing they did differently this episode was injecting a little more humor than I'm used to with True Detective. And two big scenes of that. One was when Wayne is lying to the documentarian about doubting the medical examiner's report. And then they cut back to the 90s and he's verbatim doubting, that version of events. We also get the license plate scene, which was it felt very like Beverly Hills Cop to me.
Yeah, it was definitely a little slapstick watching Roland struggle to get back to his feet. The notion of two 70-plus-year-old cops back on the case, up to their old tricks again, was a lot of fun. I'd kind of like to see a spin-off of Old Man Roland and Old Man Wayne solving crimes across the land.
It got a little buddy for my taste, but again, I like both of these characters. I was okay with it. So for the rest of this podcast, we'd like to get through a couple key things. One is probably the bulk of the podcast will be discussing the Harris-James evidence chain, basically going all the way back to 1977 and then to 2015, and really follow that chain of evidence that has different touch points with Harris-James, the cop that's helping out the Hoyts. And then we'll talk about the Hoyt twist at the end. I think it's really going to be the catapult that launches us into the finale. And then finally, just some questions that we have lingering that hopefully you can help by writing in at hosts@shatontv.com. We'll gather up all those emails, answers to those questions and more, and then share them later this week in our fan mail episode called The Watch. That's fans of True Detective, not fans of us. So for starters, let's go to Harris-James. So King B, you and I just finished watching the episode, and we thought that we had set time frames in 80, 90, and 2015. Turns out we've even got story going back to 1977 with Isabel Hoyt. We've seen her portrait up on the wall in the office of Hoyt Foods, but I don't think we had a name or any background on her.
Was it one of those spooky Disney haunted portraits?
It kind of looks like that.
I wonder if there's an HD capture of her eyes moving in the portrait, watching them during the interview.
Come back to us later this week on The Watch. We'll check it out.
All right. Break it down for us.
So Isabel, as we find out from the telling in this story, she lost her husband and child in a car accident, of which there seemed to be a lot in this show. She then loses it and crashes her own car through a guardrail. Guess who's on the job in the highway patrol just around that time and just around that area?
It's Harris James on the case, working with the highway patrol. It's easy to start putting things together and drawing the lines. Old man Hoyt comes out to check on his daughter at the scene of this accident, and Harris James is there. Clearly, he's going to recognize the wealthiest man in town. Knowing this guy draws a lot of water, he's going to make sure he does whatever makes Mr. Hoyt happy.
It's important to note the tightness of this time frame here, because we're talking 1977. James is on highway patrol with his hemorrhoids flaring up, and within a couple years, he's working state police in West Finger, very close to the power center of the Hoyt Empire. After the accident, we have Isabel being put in the care of a Mr. June, as they refer to him. He is described as a black man with a dead eye.
So now we know who our one-eyed black guy is that's been floating around. The one everyone's been hunting. So clearly we know this is the guy that shows up at Amelia's reading and at some point kind of chastises her in a way that makes it sound like this is not a malice-filled or evil guy. He's calling her out for making money and profiting off the misery of these people. It's clear he's really sympathetic to the parties that are involved. I'm really interested to know his role moving forward in relation to this crime and in this family. He's not going to be just the evil villain that we were looking for. It's going to be interesting to see his dynamic compared to everything else that's going on.
Now, in last week's deep dive, you mentioned, too, that you thought it was very suspect and unsatisfying the way that he appeared at Amelia's reading and then just poof was gone, and she never told Wayne about it. Nothing ever happened. And now in episode 7, we immediately get her telling Wayne about it, and the pieces start to come together. So a couple key things here with Mr. June is, again, we've got him as the black man with a dead eye. And if you remember, the farmer who had the farm next to the site where Will died mentioned that there was a mixed couple driving around in a sedan. Mr. June is actually charged with driving Isabel around after her accident.
So now we can pretty much say we know who the mixed race couple is that had been floating around and the couple that had ultimately delivered those strange dolls to the kids.
Right. It would seem odd and very Scooby-Doo if there were multiple couples kind of floating around. Another interesting thing about Isabel and Mr. June is they have exclusive access to an area of the Hoyt compound.
Yeah, last week we got to see the basement. We believe we've seen the pink room. Later we are told that after a point in 81, all other workers at the Hoyt compound are restricted from those basement areas, with, I believe, probably the exception of Harris James, who seems to just kind of know all and see all as far as what's going on in the compound. It's apparent that this sort of servant, chauffeur, caretaker for Isabel and Isabel herself are this mysterious couple that have been hunting around and maybe walking around dressed as ghosts.
Which brings us to 1980. So in 1980, after all these events, the Purcell children go missing. So we know Will is dead because the body is found. Julie disappears, but they pin both deaths on Brett Woodard based on evidence found at his house.
Now, we've had a lot of discussion about this before we recorded tonight. How are we explaining Will's placement? With his hands folded across his chest, there's a lot of debate over who's really involved. My whole take on it is clearly this woman is a troubled person with a lot of issues. The death is accidental, and Watts or Mr. June is, saying, hey, we got to get out of here. And she's just so distraught and being unbalanced has to place him in this sort of ceremonial position to sort of alleviate her grief.
I'm on the fence right now about whether I want to know exactly what happened that day to Will and Julie. On one hand, I'd love to know exactly the series of events and going, aha, that's what happened, right? You get that curiosity satisfied. On the other hand, there's so many variables of what could have happened that leaving that open would kind of be a nice trick. And again, we've got one episode to wrap this all up, so focusing just on that day's events could take up a lot of the episode and leave a lot of other questions unanswered. The big question that popped in my head was, if you're trying to abduct a child and her brother dies in the process, why would you set up an elaborate crime scene? You mentioned because it could be as Isabel's feelings. It could also be, again, that they're not professionals at this. They are trying this out for the first time or whatever. They don't know what to do. A kid dies, like shit, you panic and you set something up. But it seems to me like an operation like the Hoyts, with the resources they have, having already, one cop in their pocket, would just try to make this body disappear rather than setting up in a very visible way.
Well, I mean, it could be argued that as Mr. June has shown himself to not be a malicious character, and Isabel not being a malicious character, just severely troubled, that they're just not adept at the notions that, hey, we need to cover our tracks, or this is going to be really bad. We need to hide and obfuscate the details of what's transpired here. If they are acting without malice, then they're regretful, they're sorrowful, and hiding their crime probably just isn't their first intention.
All right, so let's say these goofballs are having some sort of a slapstick, hijinky sort of kidnapping. They grab Julie. Will says no. He slips on a Dungeons and Dragons dice and bonks his head on a rock and he dies, right? How do they know to pose him like his communion photo?
Well, I would assume that Mr. June, he's the one with the most faculties intact. So he's going to try to calm down Julie. Maybe, no, he just fell. He needs to rest. Meanwhile, wackadoo Isabel, who's already lost her nut from losing her husband and her daughter, is probably, I don't want to say playing dress up, but definitely like tending to this injured child, because that's going to resonate really deeply with her. Hence the flowers in his hand and just making sure that everything is all right for him to maybe just go to sleep.
Now, it's possible that Julie and Will weren't even at the same place at the same time. Freddie says that Will was off on his own looking for Julie and saying that she was with them, in which case they might have been two separate incidents. Because Julie, remember, if it's her that calls in, and they believe it is her that calls in on the hotline, she wants to know what happened to Will. She doesn't know that he's dead or has been killed.
For all we know, he slipped and fell, and then they found him after the fact.
Or Freddie killed him. Kruger. Again, there's so many other things that could be happening that we just don't know about. Lucy is not accounted for during this timeline at all. She could have been there the whole time.
Lucy could have been out there and come across him after he had fallen. I mean, maybe it is Freddy Krueger.
And an interesting possibility that you and Carrie brought up, Lucy possibly providing like a children catalog to the Hoyts. She was a Hoyt employee. She could have said, hey, here's my kids. Aren't they angelic? Aren't they good kids? Don't you want to give them a shot? Give them a better life?
I mean, based on the information that we were given in last episode from Cousin Dan, that's most likely the case. It's clear she was receiving some sort of payment from some mysterious figure, demanded more, and then got suicided. It would be safe money to go ahead and bet that she's involved in this.
So still in 1980, we've got the children's deaths pinned on Brett Woodard. Harris James is at that crime scene where we find a planted backpack that Wayne points out is way too clean to be involved in a Claymore mine blast. And Julie's clothing is conveniently found partially incinerated, but just enough of it around to know it was a little girl's sweater. Wayne brings this up to Kent and everybody else, and they say, hey, we're closing this case out. We got 10 deaths that we're going to pin on Brett Woodard. Wayne corrects them and says, no, it's actually 12, including the kids. And now we see this twice in this episode, that there was pressure to close the case based on an act of violence, somebody dying, pin it on somebody in absentia. Moving on to 1987 and 1988, we don't actually see these scenes, but through the evidence that we see throughout the series, we can place Lucy and Dan in the Las Vegas area. In this episode, episode 7, we discover that there were phone records that Wayne finds in 1990 that show 8 calls in a 2-day period from Lucy's hotel to Harris's phone line at Hoyt Foods, and then Harris flies to Vegas, and then Lucy allegedly overdoses.
I don't think she was calling him about those dollar hot dogs at Circus Circus.
Or the burger pipe. Remember the burger pipe?
I remember.
The Holiday Inn Boardwalk is the hot dog of the future.
One of the best photos of me and Gene that exists is the both of us eating the $1. Was it a foot? It's not a foot. It's like 2 feet long. It's a giant wiener. And we're at opposite ends of this giant wiener.
We're so young and so happy.
Our lives are ahead of us. We've got this Lady in the Tramp style hot dog feast going on. It's an amazing photo.
So then Lucy's body is found in her hotel. She's dead. Yeah, so I mean, this could be a lot of things. Wayne and Roland are, when they're interrogating Harris James, they ask me, did she ask and call for money? What was it? And I imagine it was something like the sort of thing where, I need money, help me out. Maybe if I don't get that money, I'll rat, whatever it is.
We've already kind of been given the playbook for her from Cousin Dan. She fights until she gets what she wants, and then she fights till she gets what she doesn't want. Our picture's been painted pretty clearly here, the fate of Lucy and what happens to her.
So after that point, Dan disappears for a while, but we see him resurface in the 90s. That's when he has that diner meetup with Wayne and Roland, offers them information for $7,000. This is around the same time that Wayne and Roland interview Harris James, and they figure he's involved, as King B pointed out in that conversation in Harris James' office, that they're pretty much saying, we know what you did.
I really want to know what the $7,000 is for. I don't need to be there the day the kids die. I don't need to know if Tom is gay. But what costs $7,000 in 1988?
You can get a Marshall stack, a guitar, and a van.
Brilliant. I love it. So the day after, Tom apparently suicides himself up at the top of the tower at Devil's Den. They go to find Dan. His hotel room's empty. His car's been abandoned. Nowhere to be found. Now they're really hungry for a new lead. Roland is saying, well, that's it. We're fucked. We've run out of leads. Wayne isn't having it. He says, no, you really think that that's what happened? We're going to go after Harris James now. I think it's a really great illustration of just how badly Wayne needs this hunt to feel validated or just even feel like a participant in the planet he's living in. Roland is just about ready to call it in. Like he's tired. He's done. He feels that they've done their due diligence. You can tell really quick it upsets Roland what Wayne is doing. He's not oblivious to it, and he knows it's going to affect him. And I think ultimately, reluctantly, he agrees to go.
And then you get the great scene where they're doing the stakeout of Hoyt Foods. You see Harris James leaving in the middle of the night. You get that great tracking shot from above that is very reminiscent of season 1. You see the two cars going down, this lonely, isolated road in the dark. And man, when they pull him over and they run the lights and the two of them get out, first of all, they look tough as shit. And secondly, I'm like, I would hate to be Harris James in this situation.
I'll tell you what, that Harris James has to have a real pair on him because he does not rattle. He knows pretty quick what's about to happen, and he doesn't let it shake him in the least.
They're very insidious about the way they pull him over. You see Wayne get in the car. He's, were you reaching for this? Clearly he wasn't. Getting him out of the car, and essentially when they make this decision to even pull him over, in that calculation, it's not like they haven't ruled out the fact that they might have to put this guy in the ground, because they basically are like, if he doesn't rattle and you don't get his cooperation, what are you going to do? You got a guy who now you have attacked as cops. He's a former cop. He's probably got some pretty big connections, and you've just made an enemy.
I mean, ultimately, this is likely their most formidable fight up to this point. This is a guy that knows all their tricks. He's probably been on the business end of these sort of dealings before. These guys bit off a little bit more than they could chew. And ultimately, I'm calling this one a loss. We'll talk about that real quick.
I just want to know where all these abandoned barns are in Arizona, because it seems like a really handy thing to have, just knowing where these things exist.
I'll never tell.
In the barn scene, we do get, some classic violence from Roland and Wayne. But we get to learn a lot about Harris James by the way he reacts to all this. You mentioned that he's not really quite rattled. He is suggesting that these guys are way off in what they think is going on.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to say they beat the holy shit out of this guy. And ultimately, when they were beating him, I didn't project it, but I thought they're going to beat this guy to death. The way they're wailing on his midsection and stuff, he's not going to make it. And the way his body slumps over and he kind of goes limp and has trouble breathing, I thought they're going to go too far, and that's what's going to happen. And as it turns out, it was probably an act, but so convincing that maybe it was happening. But again, the guy wasn't in fear for his own life. He was in fear of what may happen to him.
Yeah, this is one of two surprises that I got in this episode. And I should reverse and say that up until this episode, I don't think anything about the show shocked me, like truly surprised me in this way. I was buying the act. I was like, oh shit, this is a really brilliant piece of writing, which is they inadvertently killed the guy that knows everything. And it's a question of like police brutality. It's a question of how far do you go to get the truth. And it's an indicator of how much these guys have lost control.
I would love to have been in the writer's room when they decided how to move forward with this. Is it going to be an accident or is it going to be more malicious? And I think that you really touched on a great reason for why it has to be a shooting over a conflict rather than, well, he just fucking fell over and died, boss.
And that has to do with motivation. This guy has two cops that have beat the living shit out of him. He knows about police training. He knows that he doesn't stand a chance against two armed guys, and yet he still goes for the gun. And the only reason he would do that is he thinks the alternative of staying there until he either talks or dies anyway is not really the way to go, that he's afraid of something much more powerful than these two guys. I will say, patting myself on the back, that the second that he was getting uncuffed and you saw the way Wayne was bent forward, I was like, oh, fuck, he's going to go for his weapon.
I am surprised they wouldn't leave their guns in the car for something like that. Had they done that, this never would have been a problem.
Yeah, just remember that, guys. If you ever take anybody to a spooky old barn, you leave your guns in the car.
Or at least the guy who's doing the beating leaves his gun in the car. You're back up. If he stays well away, he can keep his pistola.
This interrogation also gives us a sense that it's not a child sex ring. Like the fact that you see Roland kind of really confident in himself, like, yeah, this is a child sex thing. And like Harris James's face is telling you, he's like, no, you guys have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, he's got floating ribs stabbing him in the lungs. He can barely breathe. His diaphragm is probably pushing against his liver. And he still manages to kind of just smirk and go, God, you guys are really fucking stupid.
Harris James goes for Wayne's weapon. He gets shot by Roland. Roland blames Wayne for it. He's like, you kind of made me do this. And then they had shovels on him, oddly enough. So that's good. And they just bury him in the woods, and somehow, again, I understand that it's not 2019, but even in 1990, I would think that burying somebody... So you got to remember, it's dark. They've got a limited amount of time. It's still dark when Wayne's burning his clothing, so they've got a limited amount of time to bury, I'm assuming, a very shallow grave, put a corpse in there with multiple bullets in it, and just hope that nobody finds it, even all the way to 2015. The only thing I think about is some sort of intervention by the Hoyts, maybe?
Yeah, it was not a good move on their part. It reminded me of the throwaway joke line in No Country for Old Men. You don't suppose they went digging around there and a pocket knife fished those bullets out to you. Clearly, these guys are cops and not criminals for a reason because they fucking suck at hiding a body.
Yeah, you also got rid of that whole barn. There's evidence all over that motherfucker. There's blood.
It's a mess.
Signs of struggle. Come on.
And then you're going to go and burn your clothes just in the middle of your backyard. Anybody could walk out and see what you're doing.
I thought that was just nice artistically. That was a beautiful shot.
It was good to see his face kind of in the firelight. I did think Big D, hungry for that sweet chocolate eye candy. Sorry there, Big D. You can't not be here and think we're just going to let you get off scot-free. But there's that sort of intense exchange, of looks between him and Amelia. He kind of stares her down and says, we cannot talk about this. And she goes, we'll talk in the morning about it then.
As the moon sets over that night, the night of Harris James's death, I think all of us are thinking, as we have in True Detective, that the cops are generally above the law. They are in control. They are the predators. And then we get the second surprise of the episode, which to me was, jaw-dropping, was the Edward Hoyt phone call.
Everyone made some sort of audible noise when that voice came across that phone. Just the look on Wayne's face when he hears who's calling. His entire demeanor changes. It's almost as if that's the moment he goes from being this, this hungry hunter-killer to the kind of confused man that's on the defensive that we're going to see later on in his years.
When that phone rang, I thought it's going to be either Roland saying, hey, we got to meet up and talk about this, or it's going to be like the cops maybe saying, like, we need to talk about this Harris James guy going missing, or maybe it was a fresh lead or something like that. The last thing I thought was we're getting a call from Edward Hoyt, who I thought was in Africa.
They're never in Africa. Before that phone rings, if they're telegraphing it correctly, she's kind of ready to give him an ultimatum. She's had it up to here with his cagey, brooding bull stuff, and she's ready to say, hey, it's time to call this quits. He gets that phone call, And all of a sudden, everything changes. The look on her face when she sees his fear, up until this point, we've seen her absolutely corral and herd him to her whim at every turn. She sort of misdirects or redirects him with sex or calling him out on his attitude and his responsibilities as a father, and really puts him in his place on several occasions. Here she is at her moment of ultimatum, and just that look in his face, she immediately abandons it and she falls to his lead.
One powerful thing True Detective does is allows our imaginations to kind of fill in the blanks and to paint the pictures on certain scenes. We get a lot of strong on-screen performance, but there's a lot of writing that allows us to see things off-screen. And one great example is Edward Hoyt. So we have not seen him yet. All we've seen is 2 cars outside the house. But even that statement where he's like, why don't you come out and let's talk about this? And you're like, wait, he's outside right now? The balls again, you're outside a cop's house. There's 2 cars out there, and you get the sense that this guy is not to be fucked with. And it's just the simple amount of planning and information that he has.
I was a big fan of Mahershala Ali going, well, why don't we do this later? And him saying, don't you think I've been patient enough with you so far? That was the thing where I thought, man, we've up to this point felt that Mahershala Ali was really the hunter. Maybe he's been the prey this whole time. The entirety of what's been going on has not gone unnoticed by Mr. Hoyt, who seems acutely aware of these two's actions from the beginning of the case.
Now, Edward Hoyt will be showing up in the season finale. We know for a fact that he's played by Michael Rooker from The Walking Dead. And we've seen his photo earlier in the Hoyt Foods office, along with Isabel's portrait. So we can look at least for Michael Rooker to make an appearance in the season finale. I cannot wait for this conversation between Wayne and Ed. This should be good stuff.
Last week we'd mentioned the page from the book that you had transcribed from us. And if there is a mystery Ed, clearly it's going to be Edward Hoyt. How does that fit into this story? We know that Amelia never wrote a second book. It's stated, I think, in this episode. But early on in the season, she mentioned that the publisher said that they could publish an addendum to the current editions of the book. Is there going to be a conflict or a confrontation with the family? We know from a flashback that Rebecca likely didn't pass away in a car accident. She does get to go to college, so she's all grows up at some point. So how does that narrative that we gather from that book fit into what we're given today on this show?
So quick recap from last deep dive. Essentially, I transcribed what was on screen in Amelia's book, Life and Death in the Harvest Moon. In that, there's a passage that talks about a car accident. I don't know who the narrator is. Presumably it's Amelia. But she's saying that they're in the car. There is an Ed waving a phone around. The phone then drops and rattles around on the ground to the bottom of her feet. The car flips over, and then as they get out, she plunges around, reaching for the phone. She gets the phone, which is now against the windshield of the car. It is intact with the screen. She also mentions that her husband and her daughter are injured. And then a page later talks about the horror that is a child unnaturally outliving the parent.
So we just assume that Amelia's the narrator. It just occurs to me sitting right here, maybe she's writing from Isabel's point of view. The only issue is that cell phone shouldn't be there in that time period.
First of all, there's 2 things that are mentioned in that passage. One is the SUV, and the other one is a cell phone. Now, SUVs technically were developed in the 30s, I guess, as far as a practical usage, but the coining of the term SUV was really mid-80s to early 90s. And also cell phones. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't even realize this. I thought we were still in the pager age around 90. But cell phones, the Motorola StarTAC was already out at that time. So you had Motorola's first flip phone was already there. So there were cell phones with screens that were portable.
Maybe that's what we're looking at. This is just a mystery that hopefully will get solved next week. And if not, I'll just never get a good night's sleep again. Thanks for nothing, Pizzolato.
Yeah, but so far, this is the only Ed we've seen. Some people wrote in on Twitter and said, hey, listen, there is an Ed in the credits who looks remarkably like the guy that got hit by the Claymore early on. So I don't know if that's the Ed, but it'd be really weird to throw in another character at this point. Although I didn't expect new characters in episode 7, and we got them. Before we wrap, a couple questions that we do have that we'd love your help with. One of them is regarding this new timeline we've seen. So we had 1980, we had 1990, we had 2015. What we didn't get is this in-between time. We see Wayne with graying hair. We see a teenage Rebecca being dropped off at college. So this would be a new timeline roughly in the early 2000s. We know that Rebecca is estranged now from Wayne and Amelia is dead, but what do we think happened with her? We definitely know she's not dead, though.
It's strange because not only is she not estranged at that point, she doesn't want to leave. Clearly, she wants to stay with her dad. So there's a closeness there. I don't know what's going to happen. I kind of don't want to know because I know it's going to make me sad.
What?
It's not just like, oh, I forgot to call on her birthday because I'm a little fuddle-headed lately. No, something awful is going to happen to these characters that I really like. And I just can't take it anymore. It's too much sorrow.
Speaking of fuddle-headed, one thing I need to bring up that is just a standalone fact, it has nothing to do with questions or the plot or anything like that, is the scene where Wayne has the revolver tucked on the back of his pants. He's in the middle of the street. He's walking with Roland, and suddenly he's in the roadway all alone. The only thing that's illuminated is that roadway. Everything else is darkness around him. It's such a gorgeous metaphor and also such a haunting and terrifying feeling.
Here's a man who's clearly lost his faculties, alone in the dark with a loaded gun. Ultimately, the most dangerous thing I can think of.
And again, this is quality by Daniel Sackheim, just showing again this is one of the pinnacles, I think, of visual achievement in this series. Another scene that had me wondering was the 2015 conversation between Wayne and Roland, when Wayne is getting fired up about this case again, and Roland asks him if the chase or getting involved again, open this all up again, is what your wife would have wanted for you. And I wondered, what did he mean by that?
I would say that he's trying to dissuade him or bring him back down to earth. But when I look at it, it's absolutely what she would want for him. Because that's when their relationship was at its peak, was when he was chasing this case and she was able to nibble the little details that were coming in because of it. Ultimately, he's doing this, I think, now because of his wife.
I think that's a large part of it. I wonder if Roland is trying to protect him from some revelation that maybe he himself has forgotten. We see in this episode in the dishwashing scene, Wayne wants Amelia to poke around. He wants her to expose stuff. He's giving her carte blanche. So we've kind of pinned Amelia as like this nosy busybody, but she's even asking like, is this okay to be doing? And I think she knows what she wants out of it, but the fact that he is encouraging her to do what he can't, right? So he can't expose all this stuff. When does his tune change? After the Harris James killing.
That makes a lot of sense. Up to this point, we just thought it was her getting glee and fortune off of his failure. But now, more than anything, it's maybe to protect her from finding out like the more dastardly details. If she doesn't know, she's safe from harm. By the Hoyts, by, police prosecution. Just in general, she gets to retain, the love that she has for the man she married. So, yeah, maybe he does start to say, it's enough. But, early on we see in the relationship, he's fed up with the police force and he wants her to go in and start some shit. He wants her to expose how shitty this is because ultimately he knows he's kind of out the door anyway.
So a lot going on with this episode. Tons of questions that we still haven't even formulated yet after just one viewing. And we're sure that you've got a lot going on out there. So again, please don't hesitate to tweet at us at ShatOnTV or write to us at host@shatontv.com. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV True Detective. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at ShatOnTV. On Facebook, search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com, where you can read all of our listener mail, check out all of our different TV shows that we do, including American Gods, Taboo, Game of Thrones, and Westworld, and just communicate with us in another way. Also, our email address, as we mentioned before, host@shatontv.com. Write into us with any comments on this episode. We'll try to get them in for the watch that's coming out later this week. Also, if you have answers to any of the questions we posed, if you know who Ed is, if you've got a theory on that, talking to you, Joe, give us your theory on that. Again, that's hosts@shatontv.com, where fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and share with a friend. And if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to leave a review that helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, the King Bee, Big D, Dick Ebert, and Carrie Gross, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us later this week for all the listener mail on The Watch.